Hello, my name is Alora, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how I went about making a Victorian era petticoat. Now, to get started on this project, I looked at some extant museum examples, as well as a few images of women in the era, and what I found was that the skirts had quite a variety of fullness throughout the 1890s. It seems like a bit of a personal choice. I presume social standing might be part of the reason for some of the fullness of the skirts. However, that might just be for practical reasons. Like, a very busy woman on her feet all day might not have wanted the extra fuss of fuller skirts, even if she could have afforded them. So ultimately, I decided to go fairly poofy. And I like the idea of a multi-tiered petticoat to provide extra volume without providing extra heat from more layers around the torso of having multiple petticoats. One of the things that kind of led me to the idea of having a slightly fuller than average petticoat was actually because I have quite large hips, and I was a little concerned that some of the smaller petticoats wouldn't actually do anything for my skirt. Because even in modern clothing, when I'm wearing an A-line garment, it is not uncommon for them to go out to the point where my hips are at their widest and then fall straight down. Because my hips provide more volume than the floof under the bottom of the skirt does. So in order to prevent that, in a Victorian skirt, I figured I should probably go a little bit poofier. I can always take off a ruffle if I need to. And it seems like in the Victorian era, skirts didn't really hang straight down from the hips. There was still a little bit of flare, even in the less full skirts. Now, I don't have a specific example of a petticoat that I'm going to recreate, but I did go for a mashup of these two. Now, this one is an example of an extant garment from the Met. It's dating to the late 19th century. And this one actually comes from the Lexington Intelligencer in 1907. And I recognize that these dates kind of reflect different styles overall in dress. However, the style of the petticoat in general really doesn't change much between 1890 and 1910, as far as I could tell anyways. So now that I know what it is that I actually want to make, I need to figure out a pattern for it. And the easiest way to do this in my mind is to go back to some original references. So in Bertha Bannard's Household Sewing with Home Dressmaking, she actually provides a pattern for a housemaid skirt that is quite simple, and I thought that would be a good starting point. Now, I just have to modify it a bit for the flounces, but that's easy enough. If you're interested in the book, there will be a link in the description down below. And I think that's it, so let's go ahead and jump into that patterning process. To start us off with, Bertha Bannard says that the housemaid skirt is usually made of 4 widths of 30-inch print. Though if the pattern is reversible, it is possible to cut a very fair skirt out of 3 widths. And that's what I'm going to aim to do here. So I'm going to have 3 different pattern pieces, one for the front, one for the sides, which there will be 2 cut of that, and then 2 cut for back panels. So the first one I am making is the front piece. Now Bertha Bannard gives instructions for this piece to be cut on a fold, and she wants 11 inches at the top and 15 inches at the bottom. So when the piece is unfolded, you would have 22 inches at the top and 30 inches at the bottom. However, I think this is going to give me more volume around the waistband than what I would like at the front of my skirt. Because this is a petticoat, I don't want too much bulk under the front of the skirt. So instead, I reduced that from 11 inches to 7.5 inches on the top. But I did keep her recommended 15 inches on the bottom. And I made these two lines 28 inches apart. That's because that is the distance between my waist and the bottom of my knee where I want the upper part of the petticoat to stop. So after I drew those two lines, I just did a diagonal line, connecting them, and cut that piece out. So then I can start on the side panel pattern. And this, she wants the top to be 10 inches, and again, I feel like that would just provide a little more bulk around the waist than what I would like. So I just used that 7.5 inches once again at the top. But I did take her recommended 20 inches at the bottom, and again I drew these two lines 28 inches apart and connected them with a diagonal line before cutting out the side panel pattern piece. The last pattern piece to be made is for the back panel, and there's going to be two of these again. Now, this one is going to be 10 inches at the top, which is her recommended amount, because I do not mind there being extra gathers at the top back, because we want a fuller backside. And then 20 inches at the bottom, once again, that is her recommended number. And I just had those two done 28 inches apart again, and drew another line to connect them and cut it out. So all three of these panel pieces are fairly simple. And the front panel you will just need one of, but you will need two of each of the sides. And as I'm not doing a patterned fabric, I can just rotate the pattern piece and cut them out side by side and save on a little bit of fabric. The next thing to do was to actually cut out the pieces. I'm just using pattern weights here. I don't feel like it's necessary to really draw out these pattern pieces on the fabric, as this skirt is going to be fairly large, so a little bit of miscutting isn't going to be the end of the world, though ideally, these pattern weights will prevent me from managing to miscut anything. And as you could probably tell going through this entire process, my lovely kittens have been excellent helpers. After everything is cut out, just to make my life a little easier moving forward, I decided to give everything a quick press. And then all of these seams are going to be French seams, so I don't have to worry about anything fraying. So first what I'm doing is I'm putting the pattern pieces together, wrong sides together, and then just pinning them in place so they can have a trip to the sewing machine. And this first seam I did is between the two back panels, and I did not go all the way up. I left about 10 inches free at the top, and this is because we need an opening to be able to get in and out of the skirt. After I stitched it the first time, I am just pressing some folds into it. At this point, what you're looking at is the right sides of the fabric are together, and I am ironing in a nice crisp fold here where the stitch line is. And the very next stitch that I'm going to do is going to be slightly farther away from the edge than the first one. So what will end up happening is I will stitch further down, and those raw edges inside will kind of be caught and encapsulated inside of a little seam. So a quick trip to the sewing machine, and this is what it looks like. You can see how on the front it looks like a normal seam, but on the back, those edges are encapsulated. You will also see me here being quite frustrated because I just realized I stitched the wrong sides together. The sides that I stitched together were the straight line sides of the pattern pieces, and I should have stitched the diagonal pieces because that's where the back opening was supposed to be. So yep, this is my first use of the seam ripper. So far, you will see it again. Okay, after that has been ripped and restitched, I'm going to go to that opening that I left and just double roll the edges in, making this tiny, about 1/8 of an inch roll that you see here. And then I'm just going to break out the iron and press it all the way down to where the stitching for the side seam begins. And then I just ran a row of stitches right over that folded edge so that the opening has finished edges. However, we end up with these raw edges here where the opening ends but before the French seam begins. And just to make sure nothing there is fraying, I'm just going to do a very basic whip stitch over this raw edge on both sides. I'm just putting down the next panel piece. And as I'm doing French seams, again, I am putting wrong sides together for the first stitch, and then I'll fold it over so it's right sides together to encapsulate this seam. So what you are looking at here is actually the wrong sides of the fabric. I'm just pressing that internal seam to one side so I can flip it over. Now you're seeing the right sides together, and I'm just pressing that fold in all the way down. And then I will stitch a little bit further away from the edge than I did in the previous seam, so that when I open the skirt up, you can see those raw edges are all hidden inside of that seam. Now, every now and then, if you're not paying close enough attention, some little threads from that inside seam where fraying has already started will get caught, so I just kind of pick those out and use the scissors where necessary to cut any threads that I might have missed while stitching. Now the next step is, if you look at the waist of this, it is much larger than what I need it to be. So I'm going to gather down these side panels here, and I'm going to do this by first going to my machine and setting it so I can use the largest size stitch available to me, and then stitching 2 parallel lines of these large basting stitches across the tops of those panels, making sure that I leave nice long tails in those threads. And then on one edge of these stitches, I'm just going to gather up all 4 of those strings from the 2 stitch lines and tie them into a knot very close to the edge of the fabric. And then on the other side, I'm going to take the 2 strings on the top of the fabric and pull them against the fabric, causing it to gather up on itself, and then push those gathers back towards the knot that I had previously created. And then once I have gathered everything to the length that I want it to be, in this case about 2.5 inches, I am just going to go ahead and tie all 4 of those threads in a knot so I don't have to worry about the gathers coming undone. I'll do the same thing to the other side so that the tops of both side panels are gathered down to, again, about 2.5 inches. Now I need to make the actual waistband. So I have a strip of fabric here that's about 3 inches wide, and I've just folded it in half, and then I started folding the edges up towards the center internally, giving me a 1-inch waistband. And give that all a very nice press. And then I also need
2 little casings that I can run cords through on the back so I can gather up the back panels using a drawstring method. So I just have a 1.5 inch piece here, and I'm pressing those edges up towards itself and then in half to create little tubes that I can stitch down with the cording inside of. Now here you can see I am working on that back edge right next to where the gathered on the side panels are, and I have placed the braided cord that I'm going to use for the drawstrings inside of this smaller channel. And then I'm stitching over the edge that the drawstring is sticking out of ever so slightly to secure it in place. And then I'm just going to push the drawstring inside of the little tube, making sure that the tube still also goes over the top of the waistband, and stitch it down. And then after that, this is where I make my next mistake, because I attach the waistband onto the center and side panels of the skirt. Yep, I wish I hadn't done this too. While I do this though, I do try to make sure that I have all of those gathers lying nicely, so when I stitch over them, there isn't any weird wrinkling going on. Then once I have finished stitching on the waistband, I'm going to my dress form, and because I have to make the waist quite small, I can't make the hips large enough to reflect my actual size with the corset on. So I'm just padding out my dress form to make sure that its hips measure the same as my own. So there's padding, and then there's more padding, and then there's more padding. And then I go ahead and put my chemise on it. The chemise is then followed by the corset, which I lace all the way closed just like it will be when I actually wear it. Now I really do need to get a hook on the front of this corset because inevitably I tighten it and it is always 25¼ inches. That 1/4 inch always slides back because I can't quite tie it tight enough. So there's currently a 1/4 inch gap in the back of this corset, and I have the same issue when I'm wearing it. But then I add the bustle pad, and then I measure the hips, which come in at 41 inches, as is my actual hip measurement. And that hip measurement is taken 6 inches below the waist, as is instructed by the Keystone Guide for Jacket and Dress Cutting. Now you can see here how I tie the drawstring and just gather up the back fabric onto that drawstring. And here is my problem. You can see how it does this odd pulling here in the front. That is not desirable. Now if there were gathers going further onto the side of the torso, it would get rid of this. However, I do not want gathers going towards the front of the skirt, so I'm going to do darts instead, which of course means I need to rip out that waistband. So seam ripper number 2, let's go. Now when I put the petticoat on the mannequin this time, I am just pinning it to the corset on the sides in order to keep everything laying nicely. And in the front, I have pinned the center of the panel to the center of the corset. I made sure when tying the drawstring in the back that I made it a little bit looser so that there would be a little extra space in the front to mark the dart placement. So I simply pinch the fabric where seems appropriate to get rid of those odd pulls that I had before, and stick a pin in it. I pin it a couple more times, once lower down on dart, and once where I believe the dart should end. And then I do the same thing on the other side. Then once everything has been pinned, I can take it off of the mannequin and move it over to my board. So you can see the width that the front panel should be is actually 12 inches, and it looks like the pleats are sitting in about 3 inches from either side. That's important to note. Now I'm just going to take out these pins that are holding the darts in place momentarily and open up the skirt, and then measure again. And then at that 3-inch mark away from either side, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin. And then because the total width of the final panel was 12 inches, and we know 12 minus 3 inches on either side gives us 6 remaining, or 3 inches from the edge of each dart before it reaches the center of the panel. So I'm just going to measure 3 inches from the center of the panel and put a pin in at that point on either side. So it looks like my darts are going to be taking about an inch out of the material. The next thing that I do is measure the distance down from the waistband to where I thought the darts should stop on each side. On one side, that measures about 4 3/4 inches, versus the other side, it measures exactly 4. So I'm just gonna kinda split the difference and decided to move the pins to 4.5 inches instead. So for this whole time, I've been working on the front of the material, but I really need that pin on the back. So that's just what I'm doing here, moving that pin that's down 4.5 inches from the front of the material to the back of the material. And then I'm just going to align those pins at the top and make a fold along that edge, moving the pins at the top and the bottom so that it holds the fold in place, and then drawing a line connecting those 2 points. A quick trip to the sewing machine will stitch that dart in place, and when I get down to the bottom edge, I just stitch about 1/2 inch down, very, very close to the edge of the fabric fold. And then instead of back stitching, I pull all of the threads together and tie a little knot at the bottom. A quick press, and then everything is ready to go back onto the mannequin. And here it is, and I am quite pleased with how that turned out. At this point, it is also necessary to refill the bobbin. This might be the first time, but it will not be the last time. And the reason I am refilling this bobbin is actually because I need to reattach that waistband. And I do it exactly the same way that I did the first time. Now I'm going around the bottom edge of the petticoat and just marking all of the places where the hemline isn't even so that I can even that up in just a second. The other thing that I'm doing is marking on the petticoat where the top of my knee will be, because that is going to be where the top flounce is attached. And I'm doing this with a safety pin so I can move the skirt around and not have to worry about losing that safety pin later. Now, using a pencil and a ruler, I just kind of go around and even out the bottom edge of that hem based on where I had placed the pins. And once everything is nice and smooth, I go ahead and cut off any extra fabric. The next thing I do is measure where that safety pin is from the bottom edge, and it is exactly 6 inches up. So I'm just going to go around the edge 6 inches up and mark and draw a line all the way around the bottom of the petticoat. And just a quick note, I did put this back on the mannequin before I marked this 6-inch line just to make sure that bottom hem was truly what I wanted it to be before I marked that line 6 inches up.
At this point, the top of the skirt is done. I just need to add the flouncy layers on the bottom. And there's going to be 2 layers of those. But this requires figuring out some math before I can get cutting and sewing. So I'm going to start with the innermost layer. That one's going to be attached lower down on the skirt. And to figure out how long that panel needs to be, I simply measured from the top of the waistband to the bottom of the skirt, and I got 27 inches. And I know I want the end distance from the top of the waistband to the floor to be 36 inches. And I got 36 inches because I know the final skirt is probably going to be about 39 inches, and you want your petticoat to stop a few inches short. So I'm going with 36 inches. Hopefully that's the right measurement. But I can't just take 36 inches and subtract 27 inches and get 9. There's a little more math that needs to go into it than that. Because I'm going to be attaching that panel up 1/2 inch from the bottom of the petticoat itself, and I have to add seam allowance to the panel, I have to add a grand total of 1 inch seam allowance for the 1/2 inch that I will be putting in. I hope that made sense. Now I'm confusing myself. The other thing to keep in mind is the hem at the bottom, and I'm going to give it 2 inches of seam allowance there because I want to give that a wider hem just to make it a little bit stiffer, but also in case I decide that I want this petticoat to be 1 inch, 1.5 inches longer, I can easily just let down the hem without having to add any additional material to the skirt. So in total, that panel needs to be 9 inches plus 1 inch for seam allowance on the top and 2 inches for seam allowance on the bottom, giving me 12 inches. The other measurement that I need is how wide that panel is going to be, and I'm actually going with 150 inches. As I'm anticipating the final skirt having a hemline that is just over 4 yards, making the petticoat hem the same size. Hopefully, I don't regret this later. We'll have to wait until I finish the outer skirt to find out. Okay, so I now have the measurement for that. Let's go ahead and figure out the top flounce as well. That one stops 6 inches above on the skirt from where the under flounce is being attached. That means that from the waistband to the point where that's going to attach is 21 inches. And if I want it to be 36 inches, the difference is 15 inches. However, this outer flounce I'm going to be adding 6 pin tucks to, and those pin tucks are each going to be 1/4 inch deep, which means they need a 1/2 inch extra seam allowance for each one of those. So 1/2 inch times 6 gives me 3 inches, so that 15 inch flounce now needs to be 18 inches. However, then I have to add the extra inch for seam allowance at the top, which gives us 19, and 2 inches at the bottom, which gives us 21. However, I am also going to be attaching lace to this panel. And I am not intending to just stitch the lace over the top and then cut back the fabric underneath. I feel like that's kind of wasting material, as the lace I'm going to be using is a little over 2 inches wide. So once I account for seam allowance for the addition of the lace, I can actually remove 2.5 inches from that panel length to get the flounce to be the correct length. I really hope that all made sense. There might be some math on the bottom of the screen to clarify. Yeah. The final measurement that I am looking for in that outer flounce is going to be 18.5 inch. And then the width going around the skirt for that flounce is going to be the same thing, 150 inches. And again, this is because of how full I know the outer skirt will be, but also because I have exactly 300 inches of that lace, so that'll give me 2 strips of 150 inches. So it works out perfectly. I've had this lace in my stash for a while. It is another inherited item, and I figured as it's going to be a petticoat, it doesn't matter if it's made out of synthetics quite as much. I do actually have the fiber content for this lace. It is 75% acetate, 25% nylon. So you know, not historically accurate, but it's fine. I mean, historical people were thrifty people. They frequently reuse their lace, so I don't think that any historical woman would frown on me for utilizing this hand-me-down lace.
And it is time to start really digging into those flounces. I'm just going to cut and tear strips of fabric that are the correct width and then stitch them together so that I have multiple panels making up this grand total of 4 yards. What you're looking at here is the larger flounce that will go on top, and I've just pinned the points of significance, so where the lace is attaching and where the tucks are going to be. And then I just measured the distance down from the top to where I want the lace insertions to be, which is 3.5 inches and 13.5 inches down, and then cutting all the way around. And here you can see that one panel has now become 3 separate pieces. And on top of that, what I have is the flounce that's going to go underneath. Before I do anything else, I want to finish the edges on the top and the bottom of both of these flounces. So I'm going to put a 2-inch roll at what will be the bottom of these flounces. Here you can see me ironing in that roll by first turning up the edge by 2 inches and then turning the top down 1/2 inch, all of this done on the wrong side. It gets a quick press and some pins, and I do this all the way around the bottom edge for both the shorter flounce as well as what will be the bottom of the larger flounce before they all get a trip to the sewing machine. And then the top edge of the larger flounce is just going to get a trip to the serger. Instead of serging, I suppose I could have just used pinking shears, but mine have gotten quite dull of late, so serger it is. So here you can see the top and the bottom of the larger flounce, and they are finished, as well as the bottom edge of the shorter flounce also being finished. Now you're currently looking at the top of the middle section of the larger flounce, and I am just folding it back on itself so I can mark where I want the first tuck to be. I want the tuck to start 2 inches from the top of this panel, and the tuck itself is going to be 1/4 inch, so I am just going to iron and pin down 2 1/4 inches from the edge. And I'm going to do that all the way around the entire panel, before then taking it to the sewing machine and just stitching down over this edge 1/4 inch away from that fold. So here's what that looks like, and then I just need to iron that tuck so that it lays smoothly. And once I've done that, I'm just putting in the next tuck, and as I want 1/4 inch separation between each tuck, this means that I measure 1/2 inch down from the previous tuck and iron in another fold at that point, as well as pinning it all the way around before this eventually gets another trip to the sewing machine where it is stitched down 1/4 inch away again. This process just repeats over and over and over again until I have 6 tucks. And if this little montage has somehow got you thinking that this is a fast process, I am here to tell you that it is not. In grand total, this took 8 hours and 24 yards of tucks, as well as I am on bobbin refill number 5 by the time I am done. This is quite the process. Though the end result is really quite pleasing if you ask me. I love the look of tucks. And of course, as expected throughout this entire thing, my kittens were keeping me company. They decided that they preferred the mat over the larger bed, so there was a change. And it's also gotten cloudy, so if the lighting has changed, I am sorry about that. Now you can see this is the top edge that's been serged, and I want to attach the lace 1/4 of an inch up on this. So I'm just going to overlap the two by 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to sew this on the machine as close as possible to the top edge of that lace. And then as there's going to be lace on the bottom of the piece with the tucks, I do the exact same thing. Once that's been stitched down, I just overlap the bottom of each piece of lace so that the fabric underneath it extends up into the lace 1/4 of an inch above the narrowest point from the scallops. And then that gets stitched down. I do that to the top of the tucked panel as well as the top of the rolled edge piece that will be on the bottom. You can see here how that looks. And then I am just going to use the iron to press back those seam allowances away from the lace. After I have done that all the way around, I'm just going to roll those seam allowances in so that there is 1/8 of an inch roll that I then iron down and then stitch over the top of that on the sewing machine. Now I'm gonna openly admit here, I am no role model when it comes to this, because eventually I get very tired of this whole rolling and ironing process at this point. There has been quite a bit of it in this project, and so what I end up doing is just taking it to the machine and hand pressing down that roll and simply stitching down about 5 inches at a time, and repeating that process all the way around. And here you can see the finished top section of the skirt as well as the 2 flounces that are now ready to be attached. To do this, I need to first gather the top edges of both of these flounces. I am doing this the exact same way that I did when I gathered those side panels at the top waistband of the skirt, simply by using my machine's widest stitch and doing 2 parallel lines around the top. Now I did stop and start this process multiple times around the edge of the skirt, generally wherever there was a French seam connecting multiple panels. Then I pinned the top decorative flounce to the petticoat at that line 6 inches up from the bottom edge. And I did this so 1/6 of the total length of the flounce was pinned to 1/6 of the skirt top. And then I just used those long tail ends of the thread in the large basting stitches to gather up the fabric until it fit into that 1/6 of the upper skirt section that I had pinned it to. And then I just pinned that down to the top of the skirt. I did this all the way around the edge of the skirt, making sure that I aligned that serged edge of the flounce with that yellow line, so that when I take it to the sewing machine and stitch 1/2 inch away from that serged line, and then turn the petticoat over on itself, that marked line 6 inches up will be covered by the flounce itself. As I sew the flounce down, I do pay extra attention to all of the gathers because I want them to look nice and evenly distributed so there isn't any weird clumping of the petticoat when I am done. Now here you can see it is all stitched down. The next thing that I did was to gather up the second flounce and pin it to the true bottom edge of the skirt top, exactly as I did with the previous flounce. And then I am just going to take that to the sewing machine and stitch it the same way that I did the top. Afterwards, I didn't want to leave any raw edges hanging around, so it got a trip to the serger to finish off that edge. And then the skirt is done. Like, really, it is done. And boy, has it been a long process. Here's the reveal. And I must say, I absolutely love this petticoat. It is full enough that it doesn't hang straight down from my hips. I love the line that it gives me without being so full that it is comical. And the swoosh in the back of the skirt is great. I've never really worn a true bustle dress before where there is a significant difference in fabric from the front and the back, and I love it. Also, yes, those are totally replica lightsabers that I am using in my hair as hair sticks. In case you couldn't tell, this was totally filmed on May the 4th, and I am a total Star Wars geek.
I hope you all enjoyed seeing how I made my pattern and ultimately this petticoat. I am quite pleased with how it turned out. It is entirely machine sewn, and I will say that definitely sped up the process. But in the future, I do have hopes of making another petticoat with more handwork done on it, because I just like the aesthetic of handwork a little bit more than machine stitching. But it doesn't actually change the functionality, so I absolutely love this petticoat. I love how fun it is to wear. The, like, swoosh factor is fantastic. But I think that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you enjoyed, then maybe consider checking out one of my other videos where I show you the making of any one of the undergarments that I wore in this video. They are all going to be linked in the cards above, as well as at the end. If you think this video deserves a like, I would really appreciate the impact that has on the algorithm, and maybe even consider subscribing. At this point, I'm coming out with a video every Thursday, so I hope to see you again, and I hope you have a lovely day.